Okay, so today it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Bob Falconer. And Bob, I listened to on, we've developed a real interest in IFS in this group. We have an IFS ongoing book study, and I've been listening to speakers who can speak about the integration of IFS and 12 step. And I heard Bob speak, and I could tell right away he'd be the perfect person to invite along. And so I'll be putting information about Bob in the chat, all of his credentials and his bio from his site and all that stuff. And I think many of you may have read that already because I've been posting it on our group. Bob's going to speak for uh, 45 minutes, an hour, whatever. He'll see how it works out. You know, we got 90 minutes, Bob, so we got plenty of time then for Q&A. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much, Bob, for agreeing to do this. So much appreciated.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to be here. Um, a lot of therapists have a really bad attitude towards the 12 steps, and this really bothers me. So, a lot of things bother me. One day I'll grow up and get over that, but this one especially bothers me because 12 steps have been so important to me personally, and I think they're so important to the culture at large. I think what it is that many therapists who've spent years and years and years getting all their advanced degrees and their fancy academic positions and all that, the therapists have a really hard time admitting that a room full of drunks get better results in curing alcoholism than they do. They just can't accept this. So study after study comes out and they're going, oh, well, that study doesn't matter. And, well, I just want to say I think 12 steps is the most important spiritual event of the 20th century, the creation of 12 steps. I really have immense respect for it. As I get older and older, and I am old, uh, I don't need to care about what people think of me anymore. I suppose if I had more recovery, I would never have cared, but I used to care a lot. And now, so I can just say what I think is true. I don't think healing happens without a spiritual basis. All deep healing is a spiritual process. It's sacred. And this can get you thrown out of therapy schools to say something like this, oh, no, it's pathology and it's a science, and that's just not true. Okay. I want to read a short poem that makes this, I think, really clear. The Healing Time by Pesha Gertler. Finally, on my way to yes, I bump into all the places where I said no to my life. All the unintended wounds, the red and purple scars, those hieroglyphs of pain carved into my skin, my bones, those coded messages that send me down the wrong street again and again, where I find them, the old wounds, the old misdirections, and I lift them one by one close to my heart, and I say, holy, holy. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about who I am and where I come from. My parents were both addicts. Dad, stone alcoholic, but high functioning. We always had food, went to church every Sunday. Mom was less high functioning, institutionalized sometimes, but they were also both child molesters and sex offenders. And my older brother and I were raped and beaten throughout our childhoods. And as soon as I could break into, get into the liquor, I started drinking as much as I could. I mean, of course, anything. When I was a teenager, my older brother killed himself. A few years later, my dad was murdered in an unsolved crime. It wasn't me. I was over 1,000 miles away with lots of witnesses. I should be dead like my brother, living in a dumpster, in prison, or something like that. And I've made it to a place where I'm in my mid 70s and I'm basically a man of joy. And I think that is what gives me the right to talk to you, not my degrees or my books or all that other stuff. Somehow I feel with this group I can jump into the deep end of the pool. I would like to claim credit. I have worked very hard. I've studied all different kinds of therapy, blah, 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 blah. But I think spirit guided me. One of the things I became as a kid so that I could become anesthetic. It's relatively well known. Severely abused children learn how to shut off all feeling. And my father was disappointed that he couldn't, trigger response in me. And he found out that the one thing that could always trigger a response in me was suffocating me unconscious. That seems to be biologically hardwired into people. And that's why this waterboarding stuff the American government is doing is a very sophisticated and intense form of torture. Nobody can override that panic that comes on when you're going unconscious from lack of oxygen. So he would do this a lot while he was raping me and beating me because it always got a response. But what happened is that very often when I was rendered unconscious, I don't know if these were near-death experiences or what you'd call them, but I came in contact with a merciful female presence. And I so loved her. She was the only kind thing I'd ever met. And she would just sort of cradle me. But then she would send me back over and over and over again. And I came to hate her. And I cursed her. And she quit coming. And then I spent years trying to find her again, trying to find any trace of that light. But I think that glimpse of light was something that saved my life, so that it didn't kill me like it killed my brother. There were lots of other ways spirit sort of intruded in my life or intervened in my life when I was a child. I don't want to go through all of that. But I think it was always there, and often in very disguised forms where I didn't realize it was spirit until many, many, many years later. So when I went to college, I was well on the pathway to becoming a stone alcoholic. I was binge drinking. I would, live on crackers and sardines and beer and rum. And it was looking really, really bad. But I just loved the release from the pain I was in, the alcohol brought. And then, fortunately, I started doing LSD and other psychedelics. This was back in 1967. And somehow they made alcohol seem really unattractive. And they, I think, derailed the train I was on enough so that I didn't go down that path to becoming a total addict and completely lost in addiction. I did later sometimes abuse drugs and alcohol, but never to that level of addiction. And I'm really grateful now that there's the peer groups, Psychedelics in Recovery, because a lot of people in the 12 steps, they really don't like the idea of doing psychedelics, understandably, but I think they can help a lot of people. And, Bill Wilson himself did a fair amount of psychedelics toward the end of his life. And they were still legal then, and he had a prescription and all that, so it wasn't technically illegal drug use in his use. But he also thought they could be of value in recovery. Okay, so I survive. I the the psychedelic experiences derail my pathway to addiction, and then I was quite suicidal, and I sort of thought, if I'm really going to kill myself, I ought to do A, B, C, and D before I do. And as I would check things off the list, I would keep adding things on the bottom. I would not recommend this as a suicide prevention program, but it worked for me. And a lot of the things were fairly difficult, like get a master's degree in psychology, get a stable house, place to live, stuff like that. And as I was doing this, I investigated every form of psychotherapy I could find. And many of them were really bad for me. Many of them were actively harmful, which is, terrible but true. And then I came into a whole series of psychotherapies based on parts work. The idea that we're made up of subpersonalities, uh, and that this is a good thing. It's not necessarily pathology. It is not pathology. Um, Early on, there was ego state therapy with Jack and Helen Watkins. I spent a lot of time at the Esalen Institute. I live near there. Their Gestalt therapy is clearly a parts work model. Uh, Pia Mellody, who I think is one of the people who understands addiction the best of anybody I've come in contact with, especially addiction to love and to other people and to relationships. But one comment here, her books aren't that great. I mean, they're good, but they're not that great because she's not a writer. But if you go to the website at the Meadows, which is the recovery center she founded, you can get her recorded talks where she's just talking. Much more sense of the power of that woman. She had a parts work model. She talked about the wounded children, and then she'd also talk about the adult adapted wounded children, which in IFS we would call protectors. And there were quite a few: psychosynthesis, voice dialogue, all of these. And then maybe 20 years ago now, something like that, I came across IFS. And IFS is, for me, the most potent and the most respectful form of psychotherapy I've encountered. And I think it is potent because it is respectful. I didn't used to put these two things together. I thought, potent meant you were, sort of go charging in there. No, I think that's exactly backwards. So I've been working pretty much exclusively with IFS since then. I wrote a book with Dick on, Many Minds Oneself, which basically shows that this whole idea of a part structure of mind is not new at all. It's found all over the world. And Plato had a multiple model of mind. It's not new. It keeps coming up and then being repressed or suppressed over and over and over again. I've taught IFS all over the place. I just got back from teaching at the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana, and taught China, Pakistan. My wife's Korean, Korea, Mexico, Canada, Europe, lots and lots of places. And I have yet to find a culture that doesn't just sort of intuitively understand this idea of parts, and that we are made up of parts. I want to say a few more things about parts and the IFS model. Dick developed IFS in working with eating disorders, which is an addiction. It's an addiction area. And I'm going to skip over the way it was developed is very fascinating, but we don't have a whole lot of time. So what he discovered is that we're made up of parts, and they come in different varieties. The ones that many other forms of psychotherapy know about are called the wounded children. And I think an interesting historical note is it was the 12-step people who led mainstream psychotherapy into the recognition of the wounded child. It comes from the ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics people. And there was one of their founders studied Hawaiian mysticism, studied this guy Max Freedom Long, who wrote about Hawaiian mysticism. And the Hawaiian mystics, had this idea of an inner child. So from the Hawaiian traditional mystics through the 12 steps into the main world of modern Western psychotherapy. So many forms of therapy know about these wounded children. What Dick discovered, and Pia Melody had also discovered, is there's another class, which in IFS we call the protectors. They're also parts, they're also wounded children, but they actually are functioning to try and protect and keep the system alive and going. So there's these exiles, and then there are protectors. Protectors come in two varieties, managers and firefighters. Managers try and prevent that exile, that wounded child, from ever getting triggered, because both of these protector parts don't want that incredible childhood pain roaring back up again. So managers do everything they can to prevent this from being triggered. And managers tend to be sort of socially acceptable, workaholism, extreme competitive sports, perfectionism, internal critic. All these are managerial kinds of functions. And they're preventative, they're proactive. The firefighters come after the exile has been triggered. The exiles down there holding all this pain will get triggered almost no matter how careful those managers are. And the firefighters, their job, we're going to stop that pain. They don't care about collateral damage. They don't care what it costs the whole system. It's just stop that pain now, now. And addictions are firefighters. In the IFS language, addictions are always some kind of firefighter activity. And another important thing about firefighters, they always come in a pyramid. And everybody's pyramid is different. And it's really good if you're working with someone or with yourself to map your pyramid. If you're a little bit triggered, you might do something like eat 2 or 3 bowls of ice cream instead of 1. If you're more triggered, you might take your credit card and go out and buy all sorts of crap you don't need and blow the rent money. If you're even more triggered, you might, drink a case of beer. If you're even more triggered, you might get into the coke or the meth or the heroin or something like that. And everybody's pyramid is different, but at the top of everybody's pyramid, it's almost always the same thing. The top of that pyramid is almost always suicide. And in IFS, we view suicide, it's a protector in there who's going, I'm the last ditch defense. If there's absolutely no way to control this pain in here, I can take them out. I can stop the pain. So, and this leads us to a very different attitude towards suicide and suicidal parts. We're very sympathetic with suicidal parts. They're actually sort of heroic, They're the last one at the very last boundary of the unendurable that's going to save the person. And we view them with that respect and appreciation of what they're doing. And instead of being hostile to them and, making these no suicide contracts and blaming them and judging them and all this other garbage that a lot of people do. And There's a very, very common interchange in IFS. You express your appreciation of the suicidal part, and then you say, if there were some way you could get this person out of the intolerable pain without having to kill the body, would you be interested? And the suicidal parts almost always answer the same. Yeah, that would be great if you could do it, but you can't. And then we just say to them, how about give us the time to prove to you that we can? And that's a way to open the door with a suicidal part. You find its good intention, you connect with its good intention, and you can turn it into an ally. Instead of this thing, many therapists are just terrified by the suicidal parts of their clients. It's scary when, somebody you're trying to help is on the verge of killing themselves. It totally makes sense to me that people get terrified of that. And I will say to suicidal parts, I really appreciate what you're doing and why you're here, and I think you're heroic. And I'm going to do whatever I can to keep the body alive. It's not because I disrespect you. I respect you profoundly, but we can heal this pain in another way. Okay, so that's the firefighters, the firefighter pyramid, and the firefighter pyramid includes addictions in the IFS model. There's the managers over here and the exiles down here. Okay, let me see. Oh, self. I forgot to talk about self. Another thing Dick discovered looking inside is that everybody has a self. And his clients would say he'd meet this part that seemed benign and fairly wise and calm, and he'd ask the people, what's that? And they'd say, oh, that's not a part like all the others. That's the self. That's who I really am. And the self is characterized in IFS by 8 C's: curiosity, compassion, clarity, courage, connectedness, creativity. There's a couple more. I always forget a few. I actually think Dick is sort of cheating here. He's lying a little bit. Self is a lot more than that. Self is actually the doorway to spirit. It's also, as you become more deeply involved with it, it's characterized by wonder, awe, luminosity, vastness, and even ecstasy, mystical experience, stuff like that. But you can't use those words in academia, in the therapy schools. You can't talk about luminosity and awe. So Dick sort of dumbed it down so that it would be academically acceptable. And he has even said this to me. IFS is a Trojan horse. We want to sort of sneak spirit in by make it seem small enough so that these people will crack open the door. And once spirit gets in there, it transforms everything. Another thing he has said about self that was super important to people like me, and for most of my career, the first half of my career at least, I dealt with other men with histories like mine. Severe trauma, severe trauma. And there's sort of a joke, but it's not a joke in the therapy world. Women go to therapy, men go to prison. But so most of the male survivors did not come to therapy. Anyway, Dick says self cannot be dirtied or damaged in any way. It's like the sun after a stormy day when the clouds part, the sun is there untouched. All I'd ever been told by professional therapists is, you're damaged goods. You didn't get stuff you needed. You got trashed when you were a little kid. It's sort of hopeless. Expect a miserable little life. Take a lot of meds, And here's Dick saying, no, who you really are is absolutely undamaged. That is a life-changing message for me and for many, many people with histories like mine. And I think it's a really important message, and I think it's true. Okay, IFS and addictions. Most people with an addiction, the first thing they do is they look at the part, which will be some kind of firefighter, who's the addict, and they will try and control it, which often you have to do that. I've taught IFS in eating disorders clinics several times, and those people will die if you don't get them eating. You know, a lot of people out of those clinics are taken to a hospital and tube fed for a while, and then they come back to the clinic. So you have to manage the addiction sometimes. That has to be the very first thing. But in terms of IFS, an addiction always has a polarization. On one side, there's a manager, and another side, there's an addict part. The manager will do everything it can to prevent the addict from getting triggered. And it will say things to the addict like, you idiot, no booze tonight, you got drunk last night, you're not going to get drunk tonight, stuff like that, stuff like that. But the exile gets triggered, and the addict part, in order to soothe, to put out those flames, starts indulging in whatever the addiction is. It keeps doing that, and there's a circle that goes round and round. It keeps doing that until the system is calmed down enough so that that exile is sort of quiescent, and then it stops the addictive behavior. But then the critic, the manager, comes back up and starts saying stuff like, you idiot, God damn you, how could you do that again? You're such a jerk, you know, on and on, blah, 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 blah. What does that critic behavior do? It increases the stress. It increases the misery of that firefighter part, thereby triggering the firefighter even more. So it creates this cycle that reinforces each other. You know, the firefighter acts out, the exile gets calm, the critic starts going, it shames the whole system. Usually the exiles are the ones who hold the shame. And then that manager just rages with its criticism, then it triggers the firefighter again. So this becomes a cycle that goes faster and faster and faster around. So in IFS, when we can, when the addiction's not life-threatening, we want to focus on that manager part too, that critic part, and see if we can get it to stop doing that hypercritical behavior. Because that hypercritical behavior accelerates the cycling of the addiction cycle. Now, if all you had was a manager and a firefighter going at each other back and forth, which is often what it appears that's all you got when you first see the client, the situation would be hopeless, as it feels very early on to almost all addicts. This feels hopeless. I'm just totally stuck in this shit. But we also have self. We have this calm, courageous, curious, compassionate part here. So what we try and do, we want to go to the manager first, if we can safely. And we develop a self-part relationship between the manager and self. And a key question is to ask the person, how do you feel towards that manager? And once you get some self-quality, oh, I'm curious and compassionate about it, you'll offer that to the manager and see if the manager can receive any compassion and get that manager well connected to self. In IFS, the locus of healing is the relationship between the person's parts and the person's self, not between the person and the therapist. It's internal. People have that power in there. And I think if you think of self as a sort of dumbed down version of higher power, this fits really, really well with the 12 steps. You have to get people in relationship to a higher power, to self. And that is what heals them. So you start with the manager. And then you go over, and you want these two parts not to be relating to each other. So you have a self to part relationship with the manager, appreciating its good intention, helping it calm down, asking if it could back off and give you some room to work with the other one. Then you go and do the same thing with the firefighter on the other side. And often you'll ask someone a question like, how do you feel towards the part of you who drinks? And they're going to go, I hate that son of a bitch. I want to kill him. Well, that's not self. And then you'd have to get that part to step back until some self energy emerges, some compassion, some curiosity. Gee, I'd like to know why he does that. I'm really open to getting to know it better. And then you develop the self part connection, a two-way connection between the self and the firefighter part. Now you've sort of eased the tension and you've got a third in there. So it's not just these two fighting each other. And then you ask them the key question. First you ask them both, which one should I start working with? And they'll usually agree and give you one. And then just ask them, are you protecting some more vulnerable part behind you? And they'll say yes, because they are. Sometimes they won't right away because they're afraid you're going to mess it up. And then you get permission. Would it be okay with you if we went and worked with that vulnerable part? We can get it out of where it's stuck and help it unload all those extreme emotions and burdens it's taken on. And then there's a process in IFS for working with the exiles. Basically what you do is you witness them first. You find out where they're stuck in the past and you go witness them as much as they want. This is not the same as catharsis. It seems similar, but it's quite different. It's whatever the part needs you to know. It's not like you're releasing pressure on a pressure cooker. It's whatever the part needs you to know so that it doesn't feel stuck alone with anything anymore. And that it's really feels that you completely get how bad it was for it. Then you invite it out of that time and place to some safe, comfortable place. And then you help it unburden, let go of all the extreme beliefs, all the extreme emotions, and any energies it had to take on back then when it was really young in order to survive. And then you also typically would invite it, and there's sort of a shamanic process to do this. You also invite it, welcome in new qualities now that there's more room inside you. Now this process can take quite a while. It usually doesn't, you're not going to do this in 10 minutes. Sometimes with exiles it takes weeks and weeks or more of work. But it can be done. A quote from Al-Anon that is just incredibly important for me, and I use it in therapy all the time. There is no human suffering so terrible it cannot be made better. There is no human suffering so terrible it cannot be made better. And that is a rock solid basis of faith for me. So anyway, you get this exile, you get all the burdens, all the gunk off of them. All parts are valuable and needed in a system. Some of them carry a lot of nasty burdens. They got a lot of nasty, smelly stuff on them. You get that all off. And then you go back to the part who let you go see it and say, hey, you see what we did? Are things a little different now? Now could you maybe alter your behavior? We don't go right in there and say, alter your behavior, you're an idiot, you're messing everything up, because they are dedicated to protecting and controlling this inner pain. So we go to the protectors, get permission to go to the exile, unburden them, and then come back to the protectors. And now they can make lasting, long-term changes in their behavior that won't feel like work. It won't feel like white knuckling anymore. These can be really deep-seated, ongoing changes. So this is quite different from most therapeutic approaches. I think it fits really, really, really well with the 12 steps. And as I said before, many therapists don't want to admit this and I think they're just jealous of the 12 steps. Because the 12 steps get such good results and they don't charge a penny. In Al-Anon, which was one of my major groups, Al-Anon, ACA, CODA, SIA, Survivors of Incest Anonymous, now Peers, Psychedelics in Recovery. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Step one. The word manager is right there. Our managers cannot do this. They have been working as hard as they possibly can to shame and criticize and control that firefighter to stop the addictive behavior. And they can't do it. There's some point where they got to say, I can't do it. I can't. It's unmanageable. And that's when there's enough room for self to get in there. And self is sort of a code word for spirit or higher power. That's another, like I say, Dick had to dumb down spirituality to make it academically acceptable. Well, I think this is one of the great geniuses of the early AA people, the phrase higher power. A lot of people couldn't stomach the idea of God or the divine. So they came up with this phrase, higher power, which I think is absolutely brilliant. Even the most dyed-in-the-wool atheist, materialist, has to admit there's a higher power. One thing, I live near the ocean, so if I was sponsoring somebody who wasn't having any of this higher power garbage at all, I'd take them down to the ocean and I just sort of say, hey, who's bigger, you or that? It's really hard to deny. Or I also live, there's a lot of woods here. For me, being inside a forest, because you're contained in it, so that, to me, that's a very strong physical representation of a higher power. So the very first step is it's unmanageable. The managers cannot do this. They just can't, because they're locked into this competitive, hostile relationship. They need this contact to spirit, self, higher power, God, whatever words you want to use. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now this is, in IFS language, self exists. There is something bigger than me that wasn't damaged by all the nasty stuff that happened to me. Or even very often, the worst damage is done to us by what we did to others. For a lot of people I've worked with, that's really what burns and eats their soul. Things they did to others, that were not so good. So the first step, the managers can't do it. The second step, we need self. Here's self, came to realize it exists and we can relate to it. And the third step is we turn our lives over to self. We let self start running the show. And that's, the whole IFS Institute used to be called the Institute for Self-Leadership. And Dick has said his definition of enlightenment is that self becomes the leader of the system. It's no longer the managers or the firefighters. The vast majority of the time, most of us are hijacked by a part. And we have some 3-year-old driving our bus. Or maybe a 12-year-old, but it's not self. Honestly, how much of the time do you wander around the planet feeling compassionate, curious, calm, creative, connected, all those things? On a good day, I'm maybe 3, 4, 5%. The rest of the time, there's some part driving my bus. Okay, in Al-Anon, we talk about the first 3 steps as the Al-Anon waltz. It's the dance we have to do every day, over and over and over. They're so important, and I think they fit perfectly with IFS, with a little bit of changing the language. Now I want to talk a little bit about the importance of language. Because I work all over the planet, well, not only that, just it's super important when I'm working with someone that I learn their language, that I don't try and impose these IFS words on them. And whatever language someone likes, 12 steps higher power. I worked a lot in Pakistan. They want to talk about Allah and the jinn and all that. Great, wonderful. I have the respect to learn their language. I want to tell you a little story about this that I think makes this really clear. One of the people I studied the most early on was Milton Erickson, a psychiatrist who, for most of his career, worked in inpatient wards with psychotics. And there was this man who had, for years, maybe decades, all they could do with the guy was feed him, dress him, get him out in the hallway. He'd stand there and he'd talk word salad all day long. Word salad is a whole bunch of words. A lot of them are real words. Some of them aren't, but they don't make any sense at all. And nobody had been able to make contact with this man for years and years and years. Dr. Erickson gets on the ward and he looks at the guy, and then he goes up next to him when he has some spare time and starts writing down the word salad and making notes about the vocabulary and the grammar the guy uses. And then when he thinks he's got it, he goes and stands next to the guy and starts talking word salad back. Only 2 or 3 days in the middle of his word salad, the guy turns to Erickson and says, "Cut it out, Doc," and then snaps right back into his word salad. Just by learning this man's language, Erickson broke through the guy's isolation that had lasted for years and years and years and made human contact with him. That's how important it is to learn the language of people you're talking with. Whatever it is, their language, their metaphor system, however you want to hold that, it's also, I think it's a matter of deep respect. I'm just going to check here what else is really important for me to say. I think I'm just going to read a couple things and then quit so you guys have plenty of time for questions. This is from a storyteller, not a therapist at all. You are not one person. You are many people, a community of moods and selves under one name. Parts of you aren't even human. They're part mammal, part reptile, part rose, part moon, part wind. And life is a question of which parts are dominant, which, in effect, possess you. I think most people walk around possessed by the dullest parts of themselves. This, the worst state of possession, is called normal. I think the farther in you go to this system and you meet all your parts, you start discovering things that are not from your own personal lifetime. They're legacies from your ancestors, they're spirits, they're intimations of the divine, I don't know, but there's a whole lot in there. It's a whole universe we don't hardly explore. And that's why I really love this one sentence. Parts of you aren't even human. They're part mammal, part reptile, part rose, part moon, and part wind. We have those depths within us. No, I have no doubt about that. I was listening to this guy, Jeffrey Mishlove, who I really like his channel, and he was saying that making real contact with spirit, higher power, self, whatever you want to call it, he said it's profoundly subversive. And that's why society tries to crush it over and over again. And it is. When you are in contact with spirit, you can't be controlled by outside forces. You can't be, sold into a life of consumerism and all that other stuff. You become free in a way that I don't think anything else can give you freedom. So that many of the forces of our modern culture are against this inner this inner journey, this connection with spirit. I also think, I know for me, it was the only thing that saved me from a descent into addiction and all sorts of nasty stuff, connection with spirit. I also think it's the only thing that's going to save our society at large, which is, I think you could consider society at large an addict who's getting near the terminal stages of their addiction. But that's very theoretical. But contact with spirit is subversive. And very often when you start making deep contact with spirit, it will be sabotaged. There's an old thing in, oh, I gotta quit real quick here. There's an old thing in recovery and therapy land. They say some people are the family pioneer, the first person in a family of addicts to get some recovery and to start recovering. And what always happens to the family pioneer? The rest of the family gangs up against them and trashes them and attacks them. Our society is like that too. It just, real contact with spirit is subversive. And I think that's one of the great things about the 12 steps. There's a bunch of us. We're not left alone with this. We can join with others who are making this same profound subversive contact with higher power. I want to read you one more poem and then I'll quit and it's time for questions. Like I said, I was just teaching in the Northern Cheyenne Reservation and the addiction issues there are incredible. But anyway, I picked this one especially for them. And the guy who wrote this was Charles Bukowski, a stone alcoholic his whole life. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out. I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke, and the whores and the bartenders and the grocery store clerks never know that he's in there. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess me up? Do you want to screw up the works? Do you want to blow my book sales? There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too clever. I only let him out at night sometimes, when everybody's asleep. I say, I know that you're there, so don't be sad. Then I put him back, but he's singing a little in there. I haven't quite let him die. And we sleep together like that, with our secret pact. And it's nice enough to make a man weep. But I don't weep, do you? Okay, thank you all for listening to me and ready for questions.
Oh, Bob, first of all, thank you, man. I've listened to you numerous times, and I'm going to be listening to this talk numerous times. I really thank you. You're doing a great service for the 12-step community.